Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a highly rigorous, really fascinating academic examination of the ultra-long-term demographic dynamics within the Japanese archipelago. We are going to look strictly at the objective data to understand how extreme environmental pressures and intense population bottlenecks fundamentally shaped early human populations here. And, perhaps even more incredibly, we'll see how those harsh physical realities eventually birthed a completely unique system of spiritual governance. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our intellectual roadmap for today. We're going to start with the hard numbers, looking at ice ages and early migrations, and then track the dramatic Jomon population dynamics. From there, we'll shift gears into a qualitative analysis, looking at agricultural salvation from Yomi, the origins of spiritual reverence, and finally wrap up with the dual governance concepts of Quo and Te.
Starting right off with Section 1, Ice Ages and Early Migration.
When we look at the ultra-long-term history of human migration into the Japanese archipelago, we have to realize that the physical environment was incredibly restrictive. It really only provided two distinct crossing windows. Because of drastic sea level drops during periods of extreme global cooling, traversable land bridges and narrow straits formed primarily during the Riss Ice Age. So we're talking approximately 190,000 to 130,000 years ago. Then a second critical window popped up much later during the Würm Ice Age, roughly 70,000 to 10,000 years ago, and that's what facilitated the arrival of modern humans. Outside of these two very specific windows, the rising waters of the interglacial periods effectively sealed the archipelago off from the entire Eurasian continent. And this perfectly illustrates what happened next. Once the Würm Ice Age ended and sea levels rose again around 10,000 years ago, the populations trapped on these newly formed islands faced profound genetic bottlenecks. Based on genomic simulations of the effective population size, what we call the N sub E model, we see an absolutely drastic contraction. At its lowest point during this early isolation, the actively reproducing population on the entire archipelago dropped to roughly 1,000 individuals. Think about that for a second. 1,000 people. It was a severe survival threshold, and it established a highly distinct, isolated genetic baseline for the early inhabitants. That brings us to Section 2, Jomon population dynamics, and specifically, the society's dramatic rise and devastating fall. So, the crucial point here is the sheer, terrifying scale of the demographic crash. During a period of global warming called the Holocene climatic optimum, the archipelago's environmental carrying capacity increased. This allowed the middle Jomon population to hit a peak of approximately 260,000 individuals. But as the climate subsequently cooled over the millennia, the population didn't just slowly taper off. It catastrophically crashed. By the late Jomon period, the total population had plummeted from 260,000 down to a mere 75,000 individuals across the entire archipelago. Now, we need to maintain an objective distance here to really understand the mechanics of this decline, because it wasn't driven solely by people freezing to death or catching diseases. It was actually a social consequence of extreme resource scarcity. As food became scarce, the Jomon people survived through deepening technical adaptation. They developed these highly labor-intensive methods to process really poor quality foraging resources, like heavily leaching toxins out of bitter nuts just to make them edible. Paradoxically, all this intense, required labor drastically increased childcare costs and physical burdens on the population, which in turn caused a long-term systemic collapse in the birth rate. The society was quite literally working itself to the point of demographic exhaustion. Moving on to Section 3, let's explore this shift into agricultural salvation from Yomi. You might be familiar with the land of Yomi from ancient myth as this sort of dark, metaphysical underworld. However, looking at the data, we really have to analyze it as a literal socio-ecological reality. Before the adoption of agriculture, the late Jomon period was characterized by mass starvation, extreme resource deprivation, and agonizing demographic contraction. The land of Yomi wasn't just a scary story. It represents the collective, lived trauma of a society that spent generations teetering right on the absolute edge of biological extinction. So what permanently ended this horrific era of starvation? It was the introduction of wet rice cultivation. The sudden adoption of continental irrigation techniques didn't just mildly improve their diets, it acted as literal salvation. It triggered a massive, five-fold increase in the environment's carrying capacity. Suddenly, there's the creation of stable, storable calorie bases that could actually survive the harsh winters and poor foraging seasons. Most importantly, it provided ultimate liberation from those immediate, climate-driven extinction events that had plagued them for centuries.
Which naturally leads us to Section 4, the origins of spiritual reverence. Now, what's really fascinating about this transition is the cultural aftermath. The collective trauma of near extinction during that massive population crash, followed directly by the absolute salvation provided by rice cultivation, encoded a permanent cultural reverence for the providers of agricultural stability. The agricultural and ritual lineages that facilitated this salvation were elevated way beyond mere political figures. They became vital spiritual focal points for a population that deeply, deeply remembered the horrors of starvation. It's almost impossible to overstate how strongly this shaped their worldview. Finally, let's look at Section 5 to see how this translates into governance, the dual concepts of ku and te.
Let's move to this comparison and see how everything we've discussed builds our final analytical framework. We really need to sharply delineate the qualitative difference between two distinct concepts of rule that emerged here. On one side, we have the ko. The ko is defined strictly as a cultural and agricultural hero. This figure is spiritually revered and naturally supported by the people precisely because this role is symbolically credited with providing salvation from starvation. On the exact opposite side, we have the te, a ruler established strictly by martial force, physical dominance, and political centralization. The ancient governance system actually evolved to place absolute spiritual primacy on the ko. It was rooted directly in that collective memory of ecological survival, deliberately setting it apart from the purely martial, forceful dominance of a te. As we conclude this explainer, I want to leave you with a rather provocative question to consider. How does ultra-long-term ecological trauma permanently code the spiritual and cultural architecture of human civilizations? When a population violently drops from 260,000 down to 75,000, the societal memory of that brutal survival bottleneck molds institutional structures for literally millennia to come. The reverence for the Koleos is, at its absolute core, a demographic and ecological response to the most fundamental human need there is, survival against the harsh realities of nature. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive.
Imagine walking into just this lush, incredibly rich valley.
Right, just abundant resources everywhere.
Exactly. You set up camp, you thrive over generations, and you really learn the cycles of the plants and the animals there.
You build a whole life around it.
Yeah. And then silently, but just inevitably, the ocean rises behind you and swallows the only bridge home.
Which is terrifying to even think about.
It is. You are completely trapped. And I mean, this isn't some science fiction movie premise. This is the literal geographical origin story of the Japanese archipelago.
It's basically the absolute definition of environmental determinism.
Oh, 100%.
Like, we often want to believe that humanity writes its own historical narrative, you know? But when you look closely at this region, we aren't writing the story at all.
The planet is.
Exactly. The planet is dictating the terms.
So if you are the kind of listener who loves looking at the massive, sort of overarching patterns of human existence, you know, the kind of knowledge that completely shifts your paradigm, then you are in exactly the right place for today's deep dive.
We have a really good one today.
We really do. We are going to explore a fascinating historical puzzle, specifically the ultra-long-term population dynamics of the Japanese archipelago. And we are going way back, like hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, and we are going to look at how extreme environmental shifts didn't just, change the physical shape of the landmass.
Right.
They actually forced the evolution of highly unique form of spiritual reverence and a whole new system of governance.
Which is exactly our mission for you today. We want to bridge the hard, quantitative numbers of the ancient past with the profound, qualitative philosophies of governance that emerged from them.
It's a huge shift.
It really is.
Oh.
So we're going to start with the raw, brutal data. We're talking ancient migrations across ice bridges, terrifying demographic crashes, and the sheer caloric math of survival.
The math is grim on that one.
Very grim. And then we will transition into the qualitative data. We'll look at how a single agricultural innovation basically pulled a society back from the brink of this slow extinction.
Which then birthed a strict conceptual divide between a naturally revered cultural hero and a ruler who governed by martial force.
It's just an incredible journey from biological survival to structural reverence. And I mean, I should definitely note, the insights we are drawing from today come from a truly rigorous stack of sources.
Very dense, very thorough material.
Yeah, we are examining geological climate data, genetic lineage research, and extensive chronological analyses of ancient texts.
And we're pulling strictly from what those sources present.
Right.
Yeah.
As always, well, we will be looking closely at ancient political structures. This deep dive takes no sides.
None at all.
We are purely reporting on the historical concepts and data exactly as they are presented in the source material. We're just here to follow the facts, however surprising they might be.
And they are very surprising.
They really are. Okay, let's unpack this.
So let us start with the geographical reality because, to understand the people, you absolutely must understand the land.
You can't separate the two.
No, you can't. And for an immense stretch of history, the archipelago was not a string of islands.
Wait, really? It was attached?
Oh, yeah. Its physical form was entirely dictated by massive climatic shifts on a planetary scale, specifically the global ice ages.
Right. Because when the planet enters a deep freeze, the water doesn't just disappear.
Exactly.
It gets locked up in massive continental ice sheets, and as a result, the global sea level just drops precipitously.
Exactly. And according to the geological data in our sources, there were exactly 2 major crossing opportunities for early humans to walk over from the Eurasian continent.
Only 2.
Just 2 highly specific narrow windows of geological time.
Wow.
Yeah. So the first crossing opportunity occurred during what is known as the Riss Ice Age.
Okay, the Riss Ice Age, when was that?
This period stretches back roughly 190,000 to 130,000 years ago.
Okay, so a massive chunk of time.
Yeah. And during this epoch, the global sea level plummeted dramatically, dropping around 130 meters below where it sits today.
Wait, 130 meters? I want to make sure I'm grasping the scale of that.
That's massive.
That is the height of a 40-story skyscraper. That isn't just a low tide. That fundamentally redraws the map of the world.
Completely.
It turns straits into solid plains, seas into deep valleys. It creates these massive solid land bridges connecting the Eurasian continent directly to what we now call the islands.
It completely transformed the topography, and early hominids absolutely took advantage of this new geography.
He just walked right over.
They walked across these vast land bridges, and we have the archaeological evidence to prove it.
Oh, we do?
Yes, specifically from sites like the Sunabara site in Shimane Prefecture.
Okay.
There, researchers have uncovered stone tools, specifically chalcedony flakes, that date back roughly 120,000 years.
Hold on, before we move forward, chalcedony flakes. For the listener and me, break down exactly what that means.
Sure.
How do archaeologists find a rock in the dirt and confidently say, yes, 120,000 years ago, a hominid used this, as opposed to it just being like a broken stone?
That is a really crucial distinction. So chalcedony is a cryptocrystalline form of silica.
Okay.
And it breaks in a very specific, predictable way, what we call conchoidal fracture.
Conchoidal fracture.
Right. When an early hominid strikes a core of chalcedony with another stone, it flakes off with sharp, razor-like edges.
Oh, so it's perfect for cutting meat or working wood.
Exactly. The stones found at Sunabara display clear, intentional strike marks like percussion bulbs and flake scars that simply do not occur through natural geological tumbling or weathering.
Nature doesn't make that shape by accident.
No, it doesn't. They are unequivocally manufactured tools. And by dating the specific geological stratum, the layer of volcanic ash and sediment in which they were buried,
Right.
we can reliably place them at that 120,000 year mark.
So we have physical proof that early hominids were walking around crafting tools, hunting.
We do.
But here is where the narrative in the sources takes a really dark turn.
Yeah.
The climate doesn't stay frozen.
Right? The cycle continues.
The Riss Ice Age eventually ends. The Earth enters the Eemian interglacial period. The climate warms, the glaciers melt, and those sea levels rise right back up.
And what's fascinating here is the tragic irony of their situation.
Tragic irony.
Yeah, because these early hominids walked into a vast, new, resource-rich territory. But when the planetary climate shifted and the waters rose, they were geologically trapped.
Oh, wow.
That 40-story land bridge vanished beneath the waves. They were cut off from the mainland entirely.
And what happened to them? Did they build boats? Did they adapt?
The archaeological record goes silent.
Completely silent.
Yeah. Over thousands of years, as the environment changed drastically around them, they were unable to adapt to the new constraints of island life. Or they eventually faced biological limitations they just couldn't overcome.
They went extinct.
They left behind nothing but those ancient stone tools buried deep in the strata, a complete dead end.
It is haunting. They walks into a room and the planet basically locked the door behind them forever.
That's a great way to put it.
But they weren't the last to make that journey. The sources point out that the second crossing happened much later, driven by another massive climatic shift.
Yes, the second crossing opportunity occurred during the Würm Ice Age.
The Würm Ice Age.
Right. This spans from approximately 70,000 to 10,000 years ago. And this time, the hominids making the trek were modern humans. Homo sapiens.
Us.
Exactly. During the last glacial maximum of this period, which peaked about 20,000 years ago, the sea levels dropped again to those extreme lows.
The land bridges reappeared.
They did, and the ancestors of the modern population walked across the dry plains.
And we have incredible genetic evidence to back this up, right? The sources spent a lot of time analyzing the high frequency of a specific genetic lineage called haplogroup D1A2A.
Yes, the genetic data is a massive piece of this puzzle.
Now, I know what DNA is, obviously, but how exactly does a haplogroup act as a 20,000-year-old footprint? How do geneticists actually read that?
It is a brilliant piece of biological archaeology. So, a haplogroup is essentially a genetic population group of people who share a common ancestor on either the patrilineal or matrilineal line.
Okay, tracking the family tree.
Exactly. In this case, haplogroup D112 is a specific mutation on the Y chromosome, which is passed down from father to son.
Right.
Mutations happen at relatively predictable rates over millennia. So, by mapping the frequency and variation of this specific mutation in modern populations, geneticists can actually trace the migration paths of ancient peoples.
So it's like a genetic barcode that gets stamped on a population, and you can just track where that barcode moved over tens of thousands of years.
That's a perfect analogy. And the data surrounding haplogroup D1DA is incredibly significant.
Why is that?
Well, on the Eurasian mainland, this specific lineage was largely wiped out.
Wait, really? Wiped out entirely?
Mostly, yeah. It was genetically overwritten, replaced, or marginalized by massive subsequent waves of migrating populations over thousands of years.
Well, because the mainland has constant movement and conflict.
Exactly. But in the archipelago, it was preserved in astonishingly high frequencies.
Because the exact same geological trap happened again.
Yes.
The Würm Ice Age ended. The ice melted. The Holocene epoch began, and the sea levels rose, completely severing the land bridge for a second time.
They were sealed in.
I really think of the archipelago during this period as a sealed environmental vault. Once that climatic door shut, whatever genetic and cultural material was inside was perfectly preserved.
That's exactly what happened.
They were insulated from the endless mainland migrations and conquests, but, and this is the catch, they were also forced to adapt to whatever extreme conditions happened inside the vault, or face the exact same extinction as the hominids before them.
And the conditions inside the vault became incredibly volatile.
Oh, I'm sure.
We see this specifically during the Holocene climatic optimum, which was roughly 7,000 to 5,000 years ago.
Okay.
The global warming during this period was so intense that the sea level rose rapidly, actually reaching levels higher than they are today.
So it didn't just go back to normal, it overshot.
It overshot significantly.
And the sources describe how this rising water literally swallowed up vast coastal hunting grounds. Entire geographic features were just erased.
Yes.
Places like the island of Iki were physically torn away from the mainland as the low-lying valleys filled with seawater, becoming permanent straits.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, just try to conceptualize the sheer societal trauma of that event.
You can even imagine.
Over a few generations, these people watched their familiar plains and hunting grounds turn into mud, then into brackish marshes, and finally into deep, uncrossable open ocean.
They saw solid land just vanish.
They saw land masses seemingly break off and drift. The visual memory of this environmental cataclysm of solid earth turning to viscous mud and floating away like jellyfish is profound.
Floating away like jellyfish.
Wait.
Yeah, the scholarly sources argue that this terrifying, generation-spanning experience of a shifting liquid earth is highly likely what inspired the region's ancient creation myths.
Oh, wow. The creation of heaven and earth narratives. Exactly. The foundational myths of deities stirring a chaotic, muddy, formless ocean with a spear to coagulate the islands.
Right.
Those are not merely abstract poetry. They are deeply compressed, culturally transmitted memories of extreme geological trauma.
That completely changes how you read those ancient texts. It is a literal description of what their ancestors witnessed.
It's geological history passed down as myth.
So this sets up the massive question for you to consider. If they couldn't leave, if they were trapped in this vault while the climate swung wildly, reshaping the Earth under their feet, how did they handle it?
Right. What happened to the people?
What happened to the populations trapped inside?
To answer that, we transition from the geological data into the hard demographic numbers of the Jomon period.
Okay, the Jomon period.
Yes, this is where the sources reveal a staggering quantitative arc. We see a massive population boom, followed by a severe, terrifying crash.
Let's examine the boom first, because it starts quite positively,
It
right?
does?
The climate warms up, the sea levels rise, and this actually creates a hyper-productive environment. We are talking about rich, sprawling, deciduous broadleaf forests spreading across the islands.
Very lush, very green.
And these forests were densely packed with highly nutritious nuts like chestnuts, walnuts. Furthermore, the newly formed complex coastal bays created by the rising sea levels became teeming nurseries for marine life.
It was essentially an environmental golden age for a hunter-gatherer society.
A forager's paradise.
Exactly. Because high-calorie food was so abundant and required relatively low effort to procure, the population exploded.
What kind of numbers are we talking about here?
According to the demographic estimates in the archaeological data, by the Middle Jomon period, the population soared to an astonishing 260,000 individuals.
Wait, 260,000 people?
Yes.
For a society entirely dependent on foraging, hunting, and fishing, without any formalized agriculture, that is an astronomical number.
It really is unprecedented.
They weren't just wandering bands barely scraping by. They were building massive, complex, semi-permanent settlements. They were producing incredibly intricate flame-style pottery. They were thriving.
They were. They had reached the absolute maximum carrying capacity of that specific lush environment.
Right.
But ecosystems are fragile. The climate shifted dramatically once again.
Of course it did.
We enter a period referred to as a neoglaciation, a sudden, prolonged cooling period.
So the temperature drops.
The global temperature drops. Those lush, broadleaf forests retreat rapidly southward, replaced by dense, unforgiving conifer forests that offer almost nothing in the way of edible resources.
Pine cones aren't exactly great eating.
Exactly. And the sea levels drop slightly, and those rich, complex marine bays dry up or change temperature, entirely disrupting the marine food web.
The easy calories just vanish. And the demographic numbers the sources present here are brutal.
Very brutal.
The population crashes from that peak of 260,000 during the Middle Jomon down to a mere 75,000 by the late Jomon period.
Yeah.
They lost roughly 70% of their entire population.
Now, traditional dramatized historical narratives often paint a population crash of this magnitude as a sudden apocalyptic event.
Right, like a movie.
The assumption is that a harsh, multi-year winter struck, and people simply froze in the snow, or some mysterious pathogen swept through the settlements.
Right, a sudden wipeout.
But the source material provides a much more rigorous, mechanistically grounded, and honestly a far more chilling explanation.
More chilling than freezing to death.
Yes.
Yes.
To understand this crash, we have to examine the concept of technological deepening in the face of resource scarcity.
Right, because it wasn't a sudden movie-style apocalypse. It was a slow, grinding demographic suffocation.
Exactly.
Walk us through the day-to-day reality of this. The walnuts and the easy marine life are gone. What is actually left to eat in a cooling conifer environment?
What remains are deeply inferior, incredibly difficult resources, specifically highly toxic acorns.
Toxic acorns.
Yes. You cannot simply forage these and consume them. If you do, the high levels of tannic acid will destroy your kidneys and cause violent illness. They are practically poison.
So you are starving, and your only food source is literal poison. How do you survive that?
You survive through relentless, grueling innovation. To extract usable calories from these toxic resources, the people had to develop incredibly complex, highly labor-intensive food processing techniques.
They couldn't just eat what they found.
No, they couldn't just gather. They had to industrialize their foraging.
Yeah.
They had to gather massive quantities of acorns, shell them, crush them, and then engage in a prolonged leaching process.
Which means soaking them.
Right. This meant soaking the acorn meal in running river water for days or even weeks to slowly wash away the water-soluble tannins.
That sounds exhausting.
It was, and then they had to dry it, grind it into flour, and bake it. It required massive amounts of daily specialized labor just to achieve bare caloric neutrality.
Let me stop you there, because I want to make sure I'm understanding the specific mechanism of the population crash. If they figured out how to eat the acorns, why did 70% of them die?
This raises an important question about the biological economics of survival. The crash wasn't caused by mass starvation directly.
It wasn't.
No, it was caused by the demographic consequences of that massive increase in daily labor. The sources heavily emphasize the cost of child rearing.
Yeah.
In this society, women were deeply, integrally involved in this intensive foraging and complex food processing. The leaching process alone tethered them to riverbanks for hours on end.
Ah, I see the math now.
It's harsh math.
If you were a woman in the late Jomon period, and you were spending every waking hour grinding and washing toxic acorns just to generate enough daily calories to keep yourself and your immediate family from starving, you physically and temporally do not have the capacity to care for an infant.
Exactly. When the caloric expenditure required merely to exist increases that dramatically, human biology and behavior adapt.
The birth rates drop.
Yes. The birth spacing between children widened significantly. Women simply could not afford, calorically or in terms of available time, to have as many children.
Right.
The metabolic math no longer supported large families. Consequently, the overall birth rate dipped slightly below the replacement level.
And that is the true tragedy of the late Jomon period. It wasn't a meteor strike.
No.
It operates exactly like the modern demographic crises we analyze today, where an exceptionally high cost of living organically suppresses birth rates.
That is a brilliant parallel.
Except for the Jomon, the currency wasn't rent or childcare costs. It was grueling physical labor and baseline calories. And over centuries, generation after generation, a birth rate just slightly below replacement level compounds.
It mathematically guarantees a slow, agonizing population collapse.
From 260,000 down to 75,000.
They were trapped in a descending societal spiral. They were working harder and deploying more complex technology than ever before just to survive the day. Yet their society was slowly and inexorably dying out.
It was a centuries-long ordeal of exhaustion.
It was.
But the narrative doesn't end in extinction. They hit 75,000, and then the trajectory completely reverses.
Yes, it swings back up.
Because something monumental happens. We are moving now from the hard, quantitative data of the Jomon crash into a profound qualitative shift in their culture and society.
An arrival of a miracle, basically.
A literal life-saving technology was introduced to this struggling civilization.
And that technology was the arrival of large-scale irrigated wet rice cultivation during the subsequent Yayoi period.
Now, I want to be very precise here. When we talk about wet rice cultivation arriving, we are not just talking about a new ingredient being added to the local diet.
No, not at all.
This was a monumental technological leap. Irrigated wet rice cultivation increased the caloric carrying capacity of the land roughly fivefold.
Fivefold, that's a staggering increase.
Right. Suddenly, a specific acreage of land that could barely keep a single family alive on labor-intensively leached acorns could easily feed 5 families.
And crucially, the fundamental nature of the calorie changed.
What do you mean by that?
Wet rice cultivation produces a grain that can be effectively stored for years.
Oh, storage.
Exactly. Long-term caloric storage is the ultimate technological weapon against a volatile climate. For the first time in their deep history, these people effectively broke the chains of unpredictable environmental swings.
Because they had a buffer.
Right. If a harsh, unseasonably cold year occurred, they no longer faced immediate demographic suffocation. They had granaries filled with surplus rice.
They stepped outside the ruthless, immediate natural cycle of feast and famine.
They did.
And the population predictably explodes again. But the sources don't just dwell on the population graphs. They focus on what this transition did to the people internally.
Psychologically.
Right. I want you to imagine the sheer societal impact of this.
Wow.
Imagine your entire cultural framework, the stories passed down from your grandparents, are defined by the generational trauma of slow starvation, of watching your villages shrink, of endless, painful labor just to eat.
A collective trauma.
And then, within a few generations, you experience explosive, unimaginable prosperity. You have surplus. Your children survive.
What's fascinating here is how that physical, biological salvation directly translated into profound structural belief.
Escaping the brink.
Yes. Escaping the very brink of extinction created a collective generational memory that became the absolute bedrock of the culture. Rice was not viewed merely as a successful crop or an economic commodity.
It was bigger than that.
It was recognized fundamentally as the ultimate salvation. It was equated directly with life itself.
And because of this intense existential gratitude for survival, the society developed a fierce, almost absolute spiritual devotion.
Right.
They didn't just respect the agronomy, they revered the rites, the seasonal rituals, and most importantly, the specific figures who oversaw and guaranteed this agricultural miracle.
This is the exact moment, according to the sources, where we see the origin of profound cultural reverence.
The birth of a completely new system.
Yes, this is the birth of the concept of the coup, the sovereign.
Let's deeply unpack this figure, the coup, because the way this sovereign emerges is completely antithetical to how rulers emerged in almost every other part of the ancient world.
It is entirely unique.
If we look at the Eurasian continent, a king or a paramount ruler usually emerged because they had the monopoly on violence.
The guy with the biggest army.
Right. They conquered, they subjugated rival tribes, they took power by the literal edge of the sword.
But the coup emerged through a completely different mechanism.
How so?
The authority of the coup was derived entirely from spiritual and agricultural legitimacy. They were the central conduit to the divine forces, the ones who performed the rites that ensured the rice grew, that the rains arrived on time, that the miracle of survival continued uninterrupted.
So they weren't forcing people to bow to them.
No, not at all. They were supported naturally and unforcedly by the populace because the populace associated them inextricably with life, abundance, and salvation from the dark ages of the late Jamon.
So the coup is essentially the untouchable founder who holds the absolute moral authority and the vision of the society.
Exactly.
But a society of hundreds of thousands of people growing into millions cannot run on prayer alone. There are logistical realities.
Administration, logistics, yes.
Right. How does "thank goodness we didn't starve" mutate into a functional, structural system of government?
This leads us to the qualitative climax of our deep dive. The strict structural distinction between the coup and the tie.
The coup and the tie.
Right. This explicit division became the foundational philosophy of the archipelago's governance, a highly sophisticated system designed exclusively to protect that spiritual core at all costs.
We have to define these two roles clearly and precisely, because this duality is the key to understanding everything that follows in the region's history.
Absolutely essential.
So we just established the coup, the sovereign. They are the revered cultural hero. Their power is intrinsically spiritual, and the sources specifically note that this legitimacy was originally deeply connected to a maternal or female spiritual lineage, closely tied to fertility and agriculture.
Right, the life givers.
They held the ultimate veto power, the final moral say. But, and this is the most crucial point, they were kept completely detached from the brutal, ugly, coercive realities of physical governance.
They did not dirty their hands.
They did not levy taxes by force.
Yeah.
They did not swing swords.
Contrast this entirely with the Tay, the martial ruler.
Okay, the Tay, who are they?
Every large, complex society inevitably requires an apparatus to handle the gritty realities of existence. The Tay was the physical, administrative, and military executor.
Muscle.
The muscle and the management. These were the warlords, the generals, the administrators who actually commanded the standing armies, put down internal rebellions, enforced the laws, and engaged in foreign diplomacy and warfare.
So they were the ones actually fighting.
Yes. For instance, when there were violent conflicts, trade disputes, or large-scale military expeditions on the Korean peninsula, it was exclusively the Thai and their forces handling that grim, bloody business.
So you have the Q praying to the harvest and holding the spiritual legitimacy, and the Thai holding the sword and managing the borders.
That's the divide.
But here is the absolute, unbreakable rule that defined this civilization. The sources make this incredibly clear. The Thai could never, ever usurp the coup.
It was a fascinating historical absolute. If a martial ruler, a Tay, gained too much prestige, especially through triumphant overseas military victories, it posed a massive existential threat to the delicate structure of the society.
Because if the guy with the sword becomes too popular, the society naturally defaults into a standard military dictatorship.
Exactly.
You lose the unique spiritual foundation that the people believe saved them from the Ice Age crash.
Precisely. To prevent this, to ensure that martial force never structurally outshone spiritual legitimacy, the society engaged in deliberate, systematic manipulation of historical records.
Yeah, they rewrote history.
They absolutely did. The brilliant, often bloody martial achievements of the Thai were frequently stripped from their individual names and attributed entirely to the spiritual core, the coup.
Oh, wow.
The systemic narrative absorbed the raw glory of the warrior to relentlessly protect the sanctity of the cultural hero.
But wait, I have to push back here.
Sure, go ahead.
I am trying to view this through the lens of pure human ambition. Look at the rest of global history. Look at Rome. A general like Caesar gets a big enough army, he crosses the Rubicon, and he simply declares himself the ultimate authority.
Right, it happens everywhere else.
Why would these powerful Tai, these generals who literally control the loyal soldiers and the weapons, agree to play second fiddle? What specific mechanism stopped a highly ambitious Tai from just marching into the sacred precinct, executing the coup, taking the title for himself, and ruling by force?
It is a brilliant question, and the answer lies in the deep sociological difference between coercion and authority.
Okay, lay that out for me.
The martial rulers, the Tai, understood a core, profound truth about human governance in this specific cultural context. Military might can undoubtedly conquer a people. You can force them to hand over their grain with a blade at their neck. But coercion is expensive, unstable, and deeply temporary. The moment your army weakens, you are overthrown. However, only spiritual legitimacy, the blessing of the coup, the figure universally associated with the generational salvation of the people, commands true, lasting, voluntary obedience.
So if a Tai kills the coup, he doesn't become the coup.
No, he doesn't.
He just becomes a murderer holding a sword.
Yeah.
And the entire population who genuinely believes the coup is the reason the sun rises and the rice grows instantly turns against him.
Exactly.
The Tai needs the coup's blessing just to keep his own soldiers from mutinying.
That's the key. It was an incredibly sophisticated self-balancing mechanism.
It's genius.
It is. If we look at the Eurasian continent, history is largely a bloody cycle of endless, violent dynastic overthrows. A new warlord amasses a larger army, annihilates the old warlord's family, and forces the scholars to write a new history justifying his new dynasty.
The classic cycle.
But the archipelago explicitly engineered a system to prevent that endless cycle. By permanently separating the raw, physical power of the Tai from the sacred, unassailable authority of the coup, they created extreme systemic stability.
Because you can't fight a god with a sword.
Right. The Tai wielded immense operational power, but only ever in service to the coup.
It is an architectural marvel of governance. It is a system specifically designed to protect the unifying soul of the society from the inevitable violent ambition of individuals.
Beautifully stated.
But protecting that narrative, keeping the idea of the coup supreme and ancient, required some extreme measures.
Very extreme measures.
And this is where we transition into the final piece of the puzzle, preserving the narrative. Because they didn't just rewrite who won a battle, they actually manipulated the fundamental measurement of time itself.
Yes, the chronological manipulation is undeniably one of the most stunning and complex aspects of this historical puzzle.
It blows my mind.
To illustrate how intensely this society protected the legitimacy and the ancient unbroken lineage of the coup, we have to look closely at how they originally recorded their own history and what happened when that history collided with the outside world.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of that.
Early historical records in the archipelago utilized a chronological method known as the spring-autumn double calendar.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the mechanics of this. The double calendar literally means they counted one actual astronomical solar year as two distinct years.
Yes, exactly.
They counted the agricultural cycle of spring as one full year, and the agricultural cycle of autumn as another full year.
That is correct. It was an agriculturally based system of timekeeping, which makes sense for a rice-growing society.
Right. But then they meet the mainland.
Now, imagine the diplomatic crisis that occurs when this highly isolated society begins interacting more heavily and formally with the highly sophisticated, vast empires of the Eurasian continent.
They realize their calendars don't match.
The scholars of the court realize they urgently need to transition to a standard solar calendar to align their diplomatic communications and historical records with their powerful neighbors.
But doing so created massive, glaring chronological discrepancies in their own historical texts.
Huge discrepancies.
Because if you have been counting every solar year twice for centuries, and suddenly you switch to counting normally, your recorded past is going to look completely skewed.
It mathematically breaks.
Specifically, when chronologists translated the old records into the new system, it created this massive issue where early rulers were suddenly recorded as living well over 100 years.
Oh, yeah. Some were mathematically recorded as living to 130 or 140.
Which is a blatant biological impossibility.
Of course it is. But rather than simply acknowledging the calendar change and mathematically having the ages of those early rules to reflect reality, the scholars of the court made a deliberate, highly calculated political decision.
They leaned into the glitch.
They absolutely leaned into it. They utilized that mathematical discrepancy to engineer a profound diplomatic advantage. They executed what historians refer to as the 600-year shift.
Wait, I'm trying to do the math in my head. If they switched to a standard calendar, wouldn't they just adjust the dates forward? Why invent a 600-year ghost period?
What was the purpose of the shift?
Yeah, exactly.
The overarching goal of the society was to ensure that the sacred lineage of the coup appeared significantly older, infinitely deep, and perfectly unbroken to the foreign powers on the continent.
Oh, it's about prestige.
Completely. In the geopolitics of the ancient world, antiquity equated to legitimacy. It was a matter of supreme diplomatic prestige to prove your civilization was ancient.
The older you are, the more legitimate you are.
Exactly. So they intentionally shifted the official founding date of their nation back by exactly 600 solar years, formally pinning the ascension of the first coup to the year 660 BC.
They simply moved the starting line of their civilization back 6 centuries.
They just pushed it back.
But if you move the starting line back 600 years, you suddenly have 6 centuries of empty history. You have a massive chronological gap where literally nothing happened.
Right. A huge void.
How do you possibly fill a 600-year void in the historical record?
They filled it by weaponizing the inflated lifespans from the spring-autumn double calendar.
Oh, wow.
They deliberately stretched the reigns and the lifespans of the early ancient coup to mathematically fill that artificial 600-year gap perfectly.
That is just brilliant. So when modern historians read the ancient foundational texts of the archipelago and see these early sovereigns living to 120 or 130 years old, it is not simply myth or magic or bad translation.
No, it's not a mistake.
It is a deliberate, mathematically precise historical patch. They took the double calendar data and used it like chronological putty to stretch the timeline.
That is exactly what it was. Chronological putty.
And it permanently cemented the ideological concept that the coup is this incredibly ancient, eternal, unshakable institution.
It is a stunning piece of statecraft and historical engineering. But of course, a society cannot manipulate the calendar forever.
Right. Eventually, reality catches up.
Exactly. Eventually, the internal timeline had to firmly reflect external astronomical reality. This permanent synchronization finally occurred during the reign of Sovereign Kinmei, around the year 554 AD.
Sovereign Kinmei. The sources highlight him as the definitive turning point. Why then?
Because during his reign, expert scholars of the calendar arrived directly from the continent.
Oh, so the audit arrived.
Exactly, the auditors showed up. At this point, the mathematical discrepancy between the archipelago's internal timeline and the continent's established timeline was physically verified and could no longer be sustained.
The gig was up.
Basically, yeah. So from that precise moment forward, the real-time, accurate chronological alignment began. The historical records from Sovereign Kinmei onward show normal, biologically possible human lifespans.
The manipulation of the deep past was successfully completed.
Yes. The ancient legitimacy of the coup was firmly established on paper, and the present was synchronized with the rest of the world.
I just marvel at the sheer dedication of that act. They didn't just rewrite who commanded a specific battle or exaggerate the size of an army. They literally bent the fabric of recorded time to protect the sacred narrative of the coup.
They rewrote time itself.
It shows an unmatched, almost desperate dedication to preserving the cultural hero, the symbol of their generational salvation, over the raw, objective facts of biological lifespans or astronomical calendars.
It demonstrates unequivocally that for this society, the cohesive narrative of spiritual legitimacy was far more important and functionally far more real than the literal truth of how many years a man lived or who held the sword on a battlefield.
Wow.
The fundamental truth of their survival as a people was tied entirely to the concept of the coup, and that concept had to be structurally protected at all costs.
Let's take a breath and look back at the immense, epic journey we have just taken today.
It's been a long journey.
We started with ancient hominids, walking across icy 40-story land bridges, only to be trapped inside a sealed geological vault by rising oceans.
Completely trapped.
We watched the Jomon people build a foraging paradise, only to see it shatter in a harrowing demographic collapse, their populations suffocating slowly under the immense grueling labor of leaching toxic acorns just to survive.
Surviving by the skin of their teeth.
And then we analyzed the profound qualitative shift. The monumental agricultural miracle of wet rice cultivation that didn't just fill their granaries, but completely rewired their collective psychology.
It birthed a whole new way of thinking.
It birthed a brilliant, highly specialized, dual-layered system of governance. A structural system that permanently and strictly separated the spiritual sovereign, the Ku, who possessed the natural deep reverence of the people,
Right.
from the martial ruler, the Tai, who possessed the physical force and the weapons. A system so critical to their identity that they manipulated the mathematics of time itself to project its permanence.
It serves as a profound analytical reminder for us today.
How so?
Geography and climate didn't just dictate what these ancient populations ate or where they built their settlements. It explicitly forced the evolution of their political philosophy.
Right.
It determined the structure of their deepest psychological loyalties. The physical environment wrote the operating rules for their entire civilization.
And that brings us to a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We have just examined in deep detail how a terrifying demographic collapse and immense environmental trauma forged a spiritual and political structure so resilient that its echoes lasted for millennia.
So the question we must ask ourselves as we look at the data today is this.
Yeah.
If an ancient climate crisis and a brutal demographic crash birthed the absolute reverence for the Krug and the structural divide of power, what entirely new paradigms of governance, structure, and societal reference are being quietly born right now in response to our own modern, compounding demographic and environmental crises?
That is a chilling thought.
What deeply ingrained systems are we building in the dark today, driven entirely by our own long-term survival instincts?
It is a massive question and one we will be analyzing for a long time. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We love taking these rigorous paradigm-shifting journeys with you, exploring the massive unseen forces that shape the human structure. Keep questioning the narratives, keep exploring the data, and we will see you next time.